The Spiritual Crisis of Modernity. Keynes, Beckett, Baudelaire. When the low, heavy sky weighs like a lid on the groaning spirit, held prey by constant boredom, and embracing the whole horizon around, it pours upon us a black day, more melancholy than the night. Baudelaire, Spleen. By 1857, when Baudelaire published the first edition of Les Frères du Mal, it was becoming evident that Europe was in a condition of spiritual crisis, a crisis that has not yet passed. The nature and causes of the crisis were, and remain, elusive, but its manifestations were forcing themselves on the perceptive observer, and Baudelaire may well have been the most acute of these in his century. Many have described the symptoms of the crisis, and it is currently a commonplace to speak of ours as an age of anxiety, boredom, absurdity, and so on. But few even now have penetrated as far as did Baudelaire into its deeper pathology. The entry of this crisis into the modern historical scene is traceable to the period running from the late Middle Ages up through the Enlightenment. Eric Voegelin, for example, has described in numerous writings the development of the spiritual condition in which the dimension of transcendence, and with it what he calls the openness of existence, has gradually become lost on a broad scale. As Voegelin observed in the opening paragraph of his essay on Hegel, when the gods are expelled from the cosmos, the world they have left becomes boring. In the 17th century, the ennui explored by Pascal was still the mood of a man who had lost his faith and must protect himself from the blackness of anxiety by divertissement. After the French Revolution, the ennui was recognized by Hegel as the syndrome of an age in history. It had taken a century and a half for the lostness in a world without God to develop from a personal malaise of existence to a social disease. The current age of anxiety and despair has long been in preparation. It marks, one might say, the depressive phase of a manic-depressive cycle. The manic phase consisting in the optimism and progressivism that grew out of the striking success of the physical sciences in the early modern era, and that found its most influential ideological expression among the philosophes of the Enlightenment, most notably Jean d'Alembert, Antillon Nicolas de Condorcet, and Robert Jacques Turgot. This earlier enterprise was one of mastery of existence through knowledge. Because of its manifest success in the physical sciences, it was enthusiastically generalized as a method and an ideal to apply to the whole range of human concerns, including the spiritual. It embodied belief in the possibility of the transformation of humanity through knowledge without need for moral repentance. In the 20th century, however, the themes of alienation and of the absurdity of the world seem to have become dominant. It is somewhat awkward to speak of these developments in the language of historical periods, cycles, and movements. In reality, the phases and levels of the life of the spirit are preeminently features of the existence of the individual person. It is only when many individuals come to share a similar structure of existence and to exhibit and notice its manifestations that one has a reason to speak of the syndrome of an age in history. What I have termed a spiritual crisis seems now to be such a syndrome, but the fact remains that any society and period are made up of many individuals, each of whom may be at a different stage of the progress through the pattern as a whole. Baudelaire became sensitive to a malaise that should have been plain enough, but was scarcely noticed by such contemporaries of his as Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill. The advocates of the Enlightenment have only slowly lost their confidence, and it is possible to find its point of view represented in any decade of the last 2 centuries. To put the issue another way, in tracing the progress of a pattern of existential inquiry, of what Plato called zetema, in which many individuals are involved, it is possible at any given time to find a great variety of levels of actual understanding and spiritual formation, represented among them according to the point at which each has arrived in his or her particular journey. And of course there are those who refuse to go beyond a certain point, or who delay looking more deeply into things until they are forced to do so by events that cannot be denied. The experience of the 20th century has been sufficiently traumatic in various ways that many have been driven to give up the Enlightenment belief in the inevitable moral as well as scientific progress of human civilization. Baudelaire had said in the last years of his life, "The belief in progress is a doctrine for the lazy, There can be no real progress, i.e. moral progress, except in the individual and on the part of the individual himself. Baudelaire, however, in this as in many other respects, was well in advance of others. It is interesting to compare the reflections of John Maynard Keynes on the attitude toward progress among the members of the important literary and artistic coterie, the Bloomsbury Group, during the second and third decades of this century. We were among the last of the utopians, or meliorists as they are sometimes called, who believe in a continuing moral progress by virtue of which the human race already consists of reliable, rational, decent people, influenced by truth and objective standards, who can be safely released from the outward constraints of convention and traditional standards and inflexible rules of conduct, and left, from now onwards, to their own sensible devices, pure motives, and reliable intuitions of the good. In short, we repudiated all versions of the doctrine of original sin, of there being insane and irrational springs of wickedness in most men. It is significant that the memoir in which Keynes made these retrospective observations, My Early Beliefs, is dated 9th September 1938, a time of extreme tension in Europe over Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland. Chamberlain flew to Munich on the 15th. And that Keynes continues with the comment that we were not aware that civilization was a thin and precarious crust, erected by the personality and the will of a very few, and only maintained by rules and conventions skillfully put across and guilefully preserved. There is a good possibility that Samuel Beckett may have had Keynes's memoir and the world it describes in mind when he was writing his much bleaker assessment of modern man, Waiting for Godot, and that he made them the target of a part of his satire in that play. The vain, egocentric plutocrat of the play is named Pozzo, for example, which was also the nickname Keynes went by in Bloomsbury, and the memoir was published in 1949, the year that Beckett was writing the play. Both Pozzos were collectors of precious objects of one sort or another, and both were aesthetes of a sort, resembling each other in this respect, even in the lack of refinement of their capacity for aesthetic pleasure. During the course of the play, Beckett's Pozzo, who in his first appearance is the very picture of complacency, is stripped of his possessions, becomes old and blind, and is finally forced by the anxious questioning of Vladimir to a realization and confession of utter despair. Pozzo, suddenly furious. Have you not done tormenting me with your accursed time? When? One day, is that not enough for you? One day he, Lucky, his slave, went dumb. One day I went blind. One day we'll go deaf. One day we were born, one day we shall die. The same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant. Then it's night once more. When time is experienced in this way, as an endless closed cycle of world-imminent birth and death, it ceases to have either flow or direction. In Beckett's words, it piles up all about you, instant on instant, in seconds that are all alike and each one infernal. Keynes and Beckett here may be said to represent two different levels in the realization of the implications of existence closed to transcendence, and as such they exhibit the early and later stages in the breakdown of the project of the Enlightenment. The difference between Keynes and Beckett is historically that between one who had seen his faith in human perfectibility shaken by the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws and the forcible annexation of smaller countries by Nazi Germany, and one who had seen, and had himself been caught up in, the cataclysm. Keynes was critical of the heritage of all Enlightenment rationalism and optimism that had formed his own mind and those of others in his circle, but his criticism did not lead him very far beyond the attitudes he criticized. And even as he expressed it, he could still say, "It seems to me, looking back, that this religion of ours was a very good one to grow up under. It remains nearer the truth than any other that I know, with less irrelevant extraneous matter, and nothing to be ashamed of." Beckett's works, on the other hand, express a vision that has no place for even the chastened rationalism of the Pozzo of Bloomsbury. Keynes's memoir may have rung the funeral knell of Bloomsbury and the heritage it represented, but Godot and the Unnameable write the epitaph over its grave. To realize that the project of human cognitive mastery of existence does not succeed, and that there are mysterious, non-rational depths in man, to realize also that purely world-immanent existence lacks direction and order. Such realizations mark a significant advance in understanding in the course of the zetema that leads out of disorder. But of themselves they are only the vestibule, as it were, of insight, only the shore surrounding Mount Purgatorio. To penetrate more deeply into the existential issue, we must turn once again to Baudelaire. Beckett's unnameable comes to feel himself occupied and dominated by demonic presences that force him to tell stories endlessly, to imagine, to think, to attempt futilely to reduce mystery to problem, and he even comes to realize that the demons are only symbolic representations of utterly irrational compulsions. But he never catches a glimmer of the possibility that human existence has not always been an experience of hopeless disorder, or that a life not closed within an immanentist Cartesian mind might not be entirely impossible. Beckett sees clearly the misery of closed existence, but he accepts its directionlessness and disorder as inevitable. The poems of Les Fleurs du Mal, on the other hand, represent many stages both of incomprehension and of insight. In the most mature poems of the collection, the closed existence is portrayed as demonic, and as the responsibility of the individual, to whom real alternatives can become open. The alternative of openness is approached only obliquely in the poems, though it is discussed explicitly in Baudelaire's last fragmentary prose writings collected in the Journaux Intimes. But the responsibility of the individual for his own torment is made quite clear, as in the following lines from The Self-Tormentor. Am I not a dissonant chord in the divine symphony? I am the wound and the knife. I am the blow and the cheek. I am the limbs and the rack, the victim and the torturer. To say this, of course, is still not to analyze the causes of the disease, but there are other poems that penetrate further. The Alchemy of Suffering, for example, both recognizes that there are alternative modes of existence possible and identifies the cause of the closed mode as a sort of alchemy gone wrong. One illuminates you with his fire, the other dresses you in mourning, nature. What says to one, tomb, says to the other, life and radiance. O unknown Hermes, who aids me and constantly frightens me, you make me the equal of Midas, the saddest of alchemists. Through you I change gold into iron and paradise into hell. In the winding sheet of the clouds I discover a precious corpse, and on the celestial shores I build huge sarcophagi. Rather than say that it is an alchemy gone wrong, however, it might be more precise to say that it is an alchemy that has begun to reveal the true character of the alchemical enterprise as such, an enterprise of human control of existence that tries to bring about an advance in level of being, not through openness towards transcendence, but through cognitive mastery and technical manipulation. The difference is essentially that between trust in freely given divine grace on the one hand, and on the other, theurgy. As an exclusively immanentist project, the alchemical enterprise is doomed to ironic successes that only reduce man to a world immanent enclosed self, changing the gold of the spirit into the baser metal of immanent selfhood, and thereby eclipsing the paradise that could begin to emerge in the soul's experiences of transcendence, and condemning the immanent self constituted by this action to the hell of closed existence. Baudelaire presents the symptoms of the resulting spiritual, intellectual, and emotional disease in images that have since become broadly familiar in modern literature. There is the sense of the constrictedness of human existence, expressed in the symbol of the closed horizon and a sky that weighs like a lid upon the soul, groaning under the torture of ennui. It is a dreary universe with a leaden horizon, he says in Out of the Depths I Cried, and in The Lid, he again takes up the image of the sky as a lid enclosing the constricted self. The sky above, this cavern wall that suffocates us, the sky, black lid of the enormous pot in which humanity, imperceptible and vast, seethes. Another of the spleen poems, I Have More Memories Than If I Were 1,000 Years Old, describes the disunity and disorder that characterize the disease of ennui by means of images of chests of drawers, tombs, cemeteries, boudoirs, all filled with disconnected fragments of remembered life. Nothings, he says, referring to these similes and the lists of their contents, equals the slow length of limping days. When, under the heavy flakes of snowy years, boredom, the fruit of dull indifference, takes on the proportions of immortality. The image of time that drags along, passing but going nowhere, is one of the more poignant and telling symbols with which he expresses the experience of ennui. In this case, we have time that limps because it is the image of crippled humanity. In The 7 Old Men, he presents a similar image of time in the form of 7 decrepit, malevolent old men, each exactly alike, who emerge one after the other from the dirty yellow fog of the swarming city, a cumulative revelation of stagnant time that drives the speaker to near madness. The feverish and troubled mind, wounded by mystery and absurdity. In Out of the Depths I Cried, the speaker realizes, at least dimly, that the ennui from which he suffers and the time he suffers through have become the very form of his consciousness, and he is tempted to retreat to a subhuman stupor to escape it. The skein of time unwinds so slowly that I envy the lot of the vilest animals who can immerse themselves in stupefied sleep. There is also the image of time in The Taste for Nothingness, that does not move at all, but simply piles up and buries one. And time engulfs me minute by minute, as a heavy snowfall buries a stiffening body. This last image closely resembles an image Beckett used to describe the experience of time when seen from the point of view of a profound realization of its directionlessness. Beckett's trilogy of novels, Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable, move from the comparatively superficial, and so comparatively less despairing, consciousness of Morin, through a progressive realization of absurdity in the minds of Malloy and Malone, to the ultimate combination of clarity and confusion in that of The Unnameable. The earlier characters could move through time in quest of at least minimal satisfactions or relief from suffering, or they could pass the time with stories. But for The Unnameable, time simply piles up. The question may be asked, off the record, why time doesn't pass from you, why it piles up all about you, instant on instant, on all sides, deeper and deeper, thicker and thicker, your time, others' time, the time of the ancient dead and the dead yet unborn, why it buries you grain by grain, neither dead nor alive. It is significant, however, that Beckett's image of stagnant time in this instance is one in which there is no movement at all, and in fact no real desire for movement. Beckett's Unnameable sometimes catches himself wishing something would happen to change a situation, but whenever he has enough presence of mind to reflect, he denies not only that hope, but even the validity of the desire. Baudelaire's image of the corpse frozen in the snows of time is a despairing one. But in the context of the poems of the Fleur du Mal as a whole, and Baudelaire indeed intended the volume to be read as a whole, it represents an extreme response that is balanced by a constantly renewed, fundamentally healthy longing for the experience of time as a movement toward freedom, insight, moral consistency, coherence of vision and of life, and ultimately toward peace, love, and joy. Beckett's Unnameable, who is presented in his trilogy as the most clear-sighted of his protagonists, considers himself superior to such wishes, and this attitude of superiority is, from the point of view of a diagnostic inquiry such as Baudelaire's, both symptom and cause of the frozen quality of the time in which man, as Beckett sees him, is imprisoned. The poem by Baudelaire which carries the diagnostic inquiry further than any work mentioned so far is probably the most widely known of any he wrote, the Prefatory to the Reader. This is a poem of accusation addressed to all who open the pages of the book, indeed, to the entire population of the age whose state of soul it analyzes. It leads the reader through a progressive revelation of his disease and his own responsibility for it. Through our own perverse and muddled choices, it tells us, we are occupied by a host of demons who swarm in our brains like maggots. Choosing fragmentation and vice, we breathe in death and descend step by step into hell, without even a sense of horror. The ultimate and central figure among our vices is identified as the spiritual disease of ennui. In the infamous menagerie of our vices, there is one that is the ugliest, the wickedest, the filthiest. Although he neither makes grand gestures nor emits loud cries, he would gladly make a ruin of the earth and swallow the world in a yawn. It is boredom. You know him, reader, this dainty monster. Hypocrite reader, my likeness, my brother. What is more important about this poem, however, and what makes it so appropriate an example with which to close this essay, is the particular treatment it gives to the alchemical theme. Once again, there is an ironic alchemy that produces the reverse of the customarily expected result. But this time the emphasis is on the inner spiritual effects of the process. On the pillow of evil, it is Satan Trismegistus who steadily lulls our enchanted minds, and the rich metal of our wills is completely vaporized by this learned chemist. It is the devil who holds the cords that moves us. What is especially significant about this passage is that it suggests very strongly a comparison with one of the major symbols of open existence in the Western heritage, Plato's myth of man as a puppet made by the gods and pulled in various directions by different cords. One of these, the cord that represents the pull of divinely given law, is made of gold, while the others, representing the pull of the appetites and passions, are made of iron. Each person, says the Athenian stranger, has the obligation to resist the pull of the iron cords, while yielding himself freely to the pull of the golden cord. Baudelaire's alchemist Satan, on the other hand, vaporizes the golden element in man's will, so that it is the devil alone who is left in control of the cords of the puppet. That the gold must first be vaporized by alchemy, in order that man may become entirely a victim of the forces that imprison him in the closed or immanentist mode of existence, suggests that in open or transcendentally oriented existence, he could have within him the presence of another pull by which he would be drawn in the direction of true fulfillment, by attunement to the divine measure. Baudelaire did not speak much more explicitly than this in his poems about the true orientation of the soul, but passages in the Journaux Intimes from his last years explicate further the direction of his thought. In My Heart Laid Bare, for example, he says, "The vaporizing and the coalescing of the self, that is the heart of the matter." Here, the moi of which he speaks is not the closed, immanent self, but the capacity for effective moral intention. In another place in the same work, he says, in a way that recalls St. Augustine, on the forces of amor Dei, love for God, and amor sui, love for self, in the soul. There are in everyone at all times two simultaneous tendencies, one toward God, the other towards Satan. The reaching out toward God, or spirituality, is a desire to ascend in degree, that towards Satan, or animality, is a delight in descending. The essential issue is the question of right order in the soul. A life governed by the pull of egoistic passion will lead finally to the condition described in Au Lecteur, and this will become, as it has for many in our age, so palpably a hell that one can no longer help noticing that a life without orientation toward transcendence is not freedom but misery. To realize that this misery is the effect of compulsively closed existence, on the other hand, requires greater discernment and also the willingness to seek a new orientation. It is common for a person who begins to realize the misery of a life without transcendent direction to hold back and wait for incontrovertible, quasi-scientific proof that there is a transcendent deity who can offer rewards comparably tangible to those toward which the iron cords pull. Baudelaire's own path up from the depths of existence was a prolonged and vacillating one, and he may well have felt this sort of temptation. But one of the indications of the profundity of insight at which his own Zetema arrived is another of his last statements in the Journaux Intimes. God is the only being who, in order to reign, does not even need to exist. The movement out of the prison of closed existence need not and must not wait upon success in the quest for certainty regarding an object of knowledge, but demands the humility to turn toward mystery, as Baudelaire eventually did, in prayer. Give me the strength to do my duty immediately every day, and thus to become a hero and a saint. What it requires is a willingness to accept human finitude, both the limitations that are inherent in human knowledge and also the incompleteness, the essential needfulness of man. The humility that makes such recognition of limitedness and need possible can also open up the possibility of discerning, in the very anguish that torments man, the first dark stirrings of a love that reaches beyond his limits. This, in turn, can be experienced and responded to as an invitation, as it was ultimately by Baudelaire, an invitation to trust and loyalty. Baudelaire's poems, when read in the total setting of his oeuvre, illustrate a truth too often lost sight of in modern literary criticism, which tends to fall victim to pretensions to scientific objectivity and value neutrality. This is the truth that art has a spiritual dimension, and that in the best art this dimension becomes explicit and critically reflective. The imaginative articulation in symbolic form of the spiritual crisis of an age requires not only aesthetic sensibility and imagination, but also spiritual insight. One artist may never even notice the conditions that make for the deadly ennui Baudelaire describes in his poems. Another may feel them intensely and represent them powerfully. Still another, however, may go beyond a merely descriptive representation of symptoms to penetrate to the heart of the existential issue. In the life of the spirit, a true diagnosis is already the beginning of a cure, which implies the corollary that the capacity for insightful diagnosis develops only in proportion as one is willing to begin the cure. The insight into the structure of the disease is an integral part of the existential inquiry, or zetema, by which the way up from the depths of existence is illuminated. Baudelaire could penetrate with such unusual depth into the essential character of the modern spiritual crisis, because he actually lived it through to the point of beginning to emerge from it.